Welcome to Footnotes and Endnotes, your left communist radio hour. My name is Uriah Mark Todorov. I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Owen Gilbride.
Hello.
Owen, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good today. It's a warm Sunday. I kind of have trouble remembering what day of the week it is. It's been a while since I've been gameplay recorded.
Sunday still stands out as a big one for me.
Yeah.
I'm still kind of structured around week and weekend, or at
Yeah.
least I've been trying to. Sunday is it's a big one. And
It's Lord's Day.
yeah, it's a Lord's Day. This is a beautiful Sunday. You know, yesterday was Rosh Hashanah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I turned on a guy's stove for him.
Oh.
Yeah.
See, I live in like one of the biggest Hasidic neighborhoods in North America, and I had no idea. Wow.
So we are here reading the final essay. I think I'm going to be repeating myself, but Sleepwalker's Inquiry, final essay, little short story. But I wanted to take this moment to talk about the pod, to do some meta reflection on the pod. We're 7 episodes in. We got 2 comments. One was a response to another one, but there's at least one person listened once.
Someone listened to an entire episode of this.
Well, not necessarily. They listened to
enough to be able to like make a convincing related comment.
That was at least like 500 words.
Yeah.
Both of those comments are like 500 words.
Yeah, and it was substantive.
Yeah, okay. Let's not gush too much about one comment, but the point is that we've been doing this for a little bit, not too long, but a little bit of time, about 7 weeks, I think. 7 episodes, 7 weeks. So what are we going to do? We're going to keep going through Endnotes. We're going to start Endnotes 3. We're going to go through that. Endnotes 4, Endnotes 5. They keep getting longer and longer. Maybe by the time we get to Endnotes 5, they'll put out Endnotes 6.
Yeah. And having just glanced briefly through them, I think there is stylistic shifts that happen. Endnotes 2, aside from this last essay, is very technical, very dry.
Very scholarly.
Yeah, the last essay is it's related largely to the same themes, but it is kind of like a journal entry.
Yeah.
And I flipped through some of the later endnotes, and there is more of a journalistic tone,
more literary, I think.
Yeah.
And so that's gonna be interesting. We'll have to flex different types of analytical muscles rather than just dealing with boring ass theory. We're gonna have to deal with literary stuff. We're gonna have to figure out a different way to talk about things, rather than just in terms of the arguments: true, false, valid, invalid. But what do you think? By the time we get to Endnotes 5, we're gonna be around 50 episodes or something. 50 weeks. That's almost a year. I'm sure we'll have a few listeners by then. We'll have a few commenters, and then we're going to finish the podcast and never speak again. Well, we'll have to we're gonna have to change the name because Footnotes to Endnotes is not very good. We're gonna have to professionalize our output so that we're on iTunes and shit, and we can say please rate us and all that sort of thing. Smash that bell. Well, you should be smashing that bell anyway. We're on YouTube, so you can still smash that bell. Yeah, exactly. Get in early, and maybe you can be a guest on the pod. But how are you going to evolve from just talking about endnotes? I mean, I'm not even a fucking left communist. I'm not a communization theory guy. We're just doing this because I accidentally got double orders of the issues.
We could both read at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
And having read through all of Volume 2, as much as I enjoyed many parts of this collection, I cannot say that I now identify as a communization person because I still don't really know what the fuck communization
I mean,
is.
I would say that I may now. I mean, I'll have to do more readings of Marx. I'll have to revisit Marx, but I do think a more convincing case was made for value form theory than for communization theory. I feel more convinced to like be on board with that, you know, interpretation of
Yeah,
Marx.
certainly, and like, you know, that might even, as we're compiling a reading list for things to read once we finish Endnotes, I'm sure the other volumes will have this as well, but there were a number of names that came up in reading this where I made a mental note of wanting to like seek out that source material.
Yeah, I don't know. Do we want to be a podcast where we just read books and talk about them? It's not
Um,
bad.
I mean, it's certainly like it would certainly be good for my own education. Like it would
Yeah,
force me not just to read stuff, but also to like talk about it. Which you don't really know if you know about something until you're forced to like articulate it on the spot.
that's true.
But that being said, like I do think because like my interest in this project is to like further my own knowledge, but also potentially to communicate with others either locally or anywhere on the planet potentially who have interesting ideas. I don't really care like what you identify with, if you're a left communist or whatever, as long as you have like some interesting thoughts about this broader area of subject matter and form some bonds and maybe get some other projects going. So moving forward, I would hope that we eventually meet and make some connections and perhaps do some like collaborative podcasts or maybe more broad discussion that isn't necessarily tied to a piece of literature.
Yeah, I think structuring ourselves as like a strictly pedagogical podcast where we read primary texts and then like go through them and try to like present them in a way, where people can casually listen and like pick up on general ideas and concepts. Like that is good, and I like doing it as well. For me, like I was motivated to start this project because like doing that sort of thing is good for me. Like whether like it's more about like my own self edification than like trying to like be really popular or something. You know what I mean? But that sort of thing will inhibit our potential audience. Like that pedagogical podcasts are by and large less popular than like general discussion
Yeah,
podcasts.
like it's mostly what I listen to as far as podcast goes, but like I feel like you kind of got to be a nerd and
Yeah.
like really dry, boring.
Well, I think as we get on, we'll become more entertaining presenters, and I think there's a balance to be struck between like just moving through the text closely and like using the text to generate like more spontaneous
Yeah,
conversation, which I think um, we should be thinking about moving more towards that in order to like be more entertaining and like enjoyable to listen to. It's like that sort of thing is just more entertaining, like a
yeah,
spontaneous conversation.
and
Like
I
that's
mean
that's what podcasting is all
there
about.
is like a real value in that because like ultimately as you're developing your point of view and your understanding, like part of what you want to be doing is like sharing that knowledge with others in hopes that like you can actually further something in the real world. And like the reality of it is that you're not going to bring anyone in if you're just like super dry and analytical, no matter how solid your analysis is. Like you
Right.
do need a little bit of like pizzazz, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I wonder how many people Endnotes have brought in. Probably a significant amount of people, honestly. I mean, probably not from outside of the left. You know what I mean? Like they're not really
Yeah,
addressing themselves to people who are not already self-identifying as like leftist or
like
socialist.
if a right wing person is like reading Endnotes, then well, they're probably not like right wing in the sense
Yeah,
that like one would typically use that term. Like they're
yeah.
probably at least more of an open-minded, exploratory type.
But I feel like they actually have like a pretty big profile, and it's like a pretty popular project. Like EndNotes 5 was very popular on Twitter when it was coming out, and I don't know, like they have a pretty big audience, and I'm sure they've convinced a significant number of people to become communizationists.
Yeah, what is the like I've just been saying communization person. person. Is it a communizationist?
I doubt it. Council communist?
Communizer?
Left communist?
Commiser?
Communist. I think they just say communist.
Communist. Okay. That's what we'll roll.
Yeah, big tent, the United Front. Anyway, this idea of just like going and after we finish with Endnotes, like reading some of the books that they have referenced or something, it doesn't really appeal to me because it just seems a bit unsystematic. Like I like working through like a significantly sized corpus from like one group, like one project, so that it kind of has like a cohesive, I don't know, identity to it, as opposed to, I don't know, moving through just like text at random. I guess, I mean, the things that they are citing are not going to be at random. They're going to be relevant to their project, but I don't know, something about that doesn't really appeal to me. So we're gonna have to figure out what we're going to do with this podcast, because maybe at that time we'll decide to just spin into like a general discussion, like talk about like current events or like ideas more generally, like without it.
Assuming that like the society we inhabit hasn't like
I
collapsed
completed.
into anarchy
Yeah,
by that point.
that's true. We might be too busy fighting on the front lines.
Yeah. It'll become like a podcast of like how to make Molotov cocktails. Just kidding, not actually encouraging violence, YouTube algorithm.
Satire, parody. Yeah, so we're gonna have to change our name. We're gonna have to figure out what we're doing. I mean, I think you are a lot more eclectic in your reading than I am. I mean, I have some views on that, but it's whatever. It's all fine. It's all good and fine. But I think that I definitely want to stay within the Marxist kind of socialist tradition, and like whatever we do, we're not going to start reading Bertrand Russell. Like I'm not down.
Yeah, I mean, like I spend a lot of time reading, and I have this weird ability to have like several reading streams going at once. So like, and like Marxism is something I've been studying a lot this year. Like even though I am reading lots of very divergent things, some which might even seem to be in the total opposite direction of Marxism, it is something I'm studying a lot, so I'm perfectly down with like this podcast being like dedicated solely to stuff in that realm, because it does feel like rich and fertile grounds for exploration.
A lot of ink spilled.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'll leave that off here. I mean, it's something that we're going to. We have enough time. We have several other volumes to get through, but it's something that we've been thinking about. I've been thinking about a lot, and if the listener has any input onto this, if they want to get involved, if they want to correspond, if they want to be on the podcast, if they have an idea, if they have a name, if they have a better name, if they have ideas for supplementary reading, for bonus episodes or whatever, just leave a comment, get in touch.
Yeah, stuff you'd like us to read that you think would be like relevant to what we're developing here.
Well, enjoy the episode. So we're here reading Sleepwalker's Enquiry, which is the final concluding essay in Endnotes Volume 2, Misery in the Value Form. So it's kind of like a personal reflection, just like short little story from the author, who is a web developer, and talking about how the value form, it's kind of like a piece of evidence for the philosophical arguments around the value form that have been building up over the course of this issue, where like, as they said in, I think, Communization and Value Form Theory, previous attempts to restructure social relations towards something more socialist, like in the USSR, did not actually go far enough towards like actually eradicating the principal underlying structures, namely the value form. And this little story gives like a good example for how like value form can really permeate every aspect of one's consciousness, and like even like restructure one's consciousness. The author tells a story of the story opens with the author relating how they are dreaming in code, and at one point they relate an anecdote where they actually solve a bug in their job as a web developer in their dream. So the idea being that even one's unconscious mind has been structured by the value form so pervasive as a form of social relations that it is completely like restructuring the deepest recesses of human consciousness. Do you have any introductory thoughts on the?
Yeah, I enjoyed this piece. I felt like the general flow of like this Endnotes Volume 2 is they start off with their what seems to be their central argument, which is that certain trends in the so-called logic of capital that Marx noted in the 1800s have continued to evolve over the course of the 20th and now the 21st century, meaning that the particular situation that we're in under capitalism, even though it still adheres to much of the same logic that Marx and other figures outlined back in the day, has significantly shifted. And this is Endnotes' the central argument for communization, is that the revolutions of the past would no longer work in the present circumstances, and we're going to need a new sort of revolution. And over the course of these essays, they get more and more abstract as they're talking about like Hegelian philosophy and like very like broad like analysis of this movement of capital. And then in this last piece, they kind of like go in the complete opposite direction. They share someone's personal anecdote, which I think serves to really highlight some of what Endnotes has been suggesting about how the nature of capitalism and the nature of work has shifted. Like, I think the analogy that this person who works as a web developer uses about dreaming in code and actually coming up with solutions for problems while dreaming, and how this is actually actual work, is like very revelatory. Because say if you were someone who worked in a field in the 1800s, and then you went home and you slept and you dreamt about working in the field, that might not be particularly pleasant. You might want some respite from like always just thinking about like your work. But, you know, dreaming about doing physical labor isn't the same as actually doing it. You're still resting in a sense. Whereas now, much more of work, and like to use the example here of like IT work, working in an office, working on computers, is intellectual work. You are sitting at a desk, you're barely moving, all of your labor is coming in the form of your attention and like your brain processing and intellectual decision making. So when you go home and you sleep and you're thinking about your workplace and you're dreaming about your workplace and you're trying to do other things, but your mind is distracted by thoughts of the workplace, this is essentially no different than actually working, because it is intellectual work. So like you're still basically doing the same task. It would be as if you worked in the field and then went home and continued to do the same work at your home. Which I appreciated that, because I did feel like the last few essays were getting like very like broad, very like hard to like grasp in certain areas, and this really brings it back home in a more like immediate sort of way. And it's not very long. There's not a lot of theory in it at all, but like I think reading it, if you're someone living in contemporary capitalist society, you'll probably read it and feel some degree of recognition to your own lived experience, which I think is very useful.
Yeah, I think thematically it really sums up and like puts like a nice finish on this volume. Like what you were just saying about how intellectual labor is like performed off of the job site. It goes back to the essay Notes on the New Housing Question, where they talk about, there's a section heading called De-differentiation of the reproductive and productive spheres. So like it's something that they've been like arguing, alluding to throughout the issue, and it's something obviously that theoreticians have been talking about for some time, which is this idea that like neoliberal capitalism, or capitalism in the under the regime of neoliberalism, it's really all about permeating every aspect of human activity, including the reproductive aspect, like the times of the day when we are not at work, when we are supposed to be like doing what it takes in order to live, to make it to the next work day, like all of those times and all the activities that we engage in during that time have become commoditized and like coupled to the value form.
Yeah, and I do think that's something that has perhaps gotten even worse since this edition of Endnotes was published 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And at one point in this piece, the writer is describing their employers who are like born again fundamentalist Christians and who do like seminars and try to push to convert their employees to Christianity and sort of just push their particular worldview, their particular moral underpinning onto people, which incidentally that's not something specific to capital, but it kind of just demonstrates how like under capital you'll end up in these situations where those who have power are able to kind of like just push their views onto you. And I think like that speaks to this more recent phenomenon you see where potential employers will scope out your social media feed and keep track of what you're doing in your free time, to see what you're doing on the weekend, to see sort of what kind of media you consume, what kind of political views you have, and they can use this to inform whether or not they employ you. They can punish you in the workplace just based on things you do in your own time. So as a response to that, many people have begun to carefully cultivate their social media image to fit to what they want to be for their employer. They try to be this particular model employee for the workplace. Basically, social media has just become an extension of LinkedIn, which I find depressing because at one point the internet felt like this free frontier of expression and communication, and it's slowly just become like co-opted and like.
Well, there's still a possibility for people to be anonymous or adopt a pseudonym.
This is very true. This is very true. I mean, like, the internet is to a large degree still the best like communication platform that we have, and I think it is a great asset. But you can see how the machinery is like trying its best to try to like do to it what it's done to every other communication platform that's developed.
Mm-hmm. I think the so as you said, like in this story, the narrator is employed by some Christians, and I think like that thematically fits in with the whole idea of the value form and this like blurring of the boundaries between the two spheres of life, and kind of like goes into seeing how like capitalism and life under capitalism is internalized by people, and it becomes like a spirituality, like the complete way in which to frame all of one's life and activity. Yeah, interesting. Like I feel like it fits in thematically as well, like to such an extent that I don't even expect it to necessarily be like a true story or whatever. But yeah, so this piece, it's called Sleepworkers Inquiry, and it fits into like the old socialist tradition of doing a workers' inquiry, where you go into a particular work site or like industry or whatever, and kind of like do social investigation to figure out what the problems faced by the people in that area are, and like what the possibilities for struggle against like the forms of oppression that they face are. And that's like an old tradition. It goes back a long time, and it's very important to socialist movements, to workers movements. And the conclusion here is that there's no possibility for resistance within the specifically within the sphere of like web development or like programming, I guess. It's not just about doing like small instances of sabotage or of like work stoppage. Like they talk about how if they were to go slowly, then they would just have to go more quickly at some point in the future. And if they did like a bad job, then it would just be like it would just cause problems for them. But it's about like the structure of the work itself, and like how they are working in teams, and how like the labor is kind of like federated, democratized in like the way that open source development is, where like things don't really like the product of one's labor doesn't really belong to oneself. It is not really reducible to one agent, but is really like the work of a team or something. Like I think there's like a more general argument that is being made, but the author talks about how like they're employed by like a small company, and they have like a supervisor who does some programming, but they work alone. I'll read from page 162 here. If then Workers' Enquiry is about unearthing a secret history of micro-rebellions, exposing the possibilities for struggle in the fine grain of lived experience, and in the process bringing consciousness of this to oneself as well as other workers, this is Workers' Enquiry in the cynical mode. We struggle, we are recalcitrant, but as techies against business, our struggle and our recalcitrance are integral to the movement of capital. And as workers against capital, our struggle has absolutely no horizon, and indeed is barely struggle at all. Our day-to-day interest as workers is, in the most part, practically aligned with that of this particular capital. If programmers are a vanguard in the enshrinement of use value, of technological libertarianism, of collaborative work, of moralistic best practices, of the freedom of information, it is because all of these things are posited as necessary in the movement of capital. The systematic normativity with which our working practice is shot through is merely a universalization of capital's own logic. Like, there's something about how all of and then like the next paragraph goes on to talk about standards, and specifically in the context of web development, like over the course of the history of the internet, like standards became more and more important, so that like different firms doing different things, different like independent developers, there could be consistency on the internet, and like web browsers would be able to work in like a consistent way, blah blah blah. Like standards are very important for the internet and for programming more generally. So I think the idea is more about how like just the job of programming, and specifically programming like coding, is in some way has been structured and set up so that it is like a microcosm of capital's own logic, as they're saying.
Do you feel like web development's like it's an interesting one to look at because it's like this field of labor that like has only really come into existence like very late in like capitalist development. Like it's hard to think about it existing in another form because like it came into being. There is like no pre-capitalist like web coding. And,
Yeah.
like the internet itself is like what isn't it like the product of like military industrial complex.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's weird how even though like on the one hand the internet feels like this repository of free information and like open communication of any idea, on the other hand, like as they outline here, there is this like very capitalist logic like fundamental to it.
Yeah, this is like like the use of the term libertarianism in the quote that I just read is very important, because like the ideology of techies is so closely tied in with libertarianism. Like just the idea that you can have like a space that is able to relate to the market, but which is somehow like free of state regulation or something, and like that's going to turn out in a good way.
Mm.
And obviously that just leads to the kind of monopolism that we see like throughout society, not least on the internet. Like that kind of like absence of state regulation in the market, which is what libertarianism is really all about. It just leads to every restaurant in America being a fast food chain, and every website on the internet being hosted on Amazon servers, or like supported by like Squarespace.
But yeah, there's something I never really thought of is like when like libertarianism was really big, say around like 2008, like when that was like the main sort of right wing ideology was libertarianism, and I think it's kind of like it's faded a bit in the last 10 years. But like pretty much every libertarian I knew was also like a computer programmer.
Yeah.
Hadn't consciously made that connection until now.
Yeah, I mean that has to do with like the overlapping demographics. I think like most programmers are like white men, and most libertarians are white men, and like libertarian is like it's a very privileged political ideology to be able to hold, obviously, because like in order to like advocate for a lack of like checks and balances of like state control, you have to be obviously already well off enough that you don't want more from society,
Yeah.
that you don't want or need like some form of protection.
Well, yeah, it's like the modern, like 2000s era North American libertarian is basically like someone who grew up in the suburbs and like everything seems to be like running smoothly, or maybe it did more so like 15 years ago. And, the idea of libertarianism is just presented like, hey, this seems to be running itself basically. What if we just like let everyone do more drugs and like watch whatever kind of porn they wanted and buy bazookas off the internet?
Yeah.
So it's like this kind of like very like, I don't know, basic view of like, yeah, everything's going great. Let's just like make everyone more free.
Yeah, something that I think about a lot is free software versus open source software. Do you know what the distinction is?
No, actually.
All right. If you're viewing this on or listening to this on YouTube, I have a lot of videos on this. It's something that an idea that I've been trying to work out. But basically, free software is kind of like a philosophy of like software development that is first developed by Richard Stallman. Do you know who that is?
No.
He's like a kind of freaky guy. He was canceled recently, right?
Okay.
Rightfully so.
Okay.
But he came up with this idea of free software, and he's also like one of the important contributors to GNU/Linux. Like Linux is a kernel, and then all the software that is based on that kernel he developed, and Linux exists because of him, as well as Linus Torvalds. Anyway, and like he wrote a bunch of like software licenses, the GNU public license or whatever. But basically, the idea is that no software or code should ever be like proprietary. It should always be like anybody can download any piece of software, modify the code, rename the program, and be able to redistribute it on their own. Like all code should be open source in that way, but like more it's like more radical than open source, because like everybody should, like, you shouldn't be able to make profit off of code or something. I don't know, whatever. It's like the idea is that like everybody should be able to download the source code for any piece of software that they have, modify it, and then be able to repackage it and whatever. Which kind of like that movement is like very old. Like he came up with it in the early 90s, I think, and obviously like he was no more than a libertarian, so is absent any kind of like corresponding like political movement that sort of philosophy would need in order to develop into anything other than what it did develop into, which is open source software, which is like pure libertarianism. So like that kind of philosophy is all about like not having any kind of like centralized state marketplace. It's like pure libertarianism in in a way that could also be like socialist, but because there is no socialist movement like wrapped up in it, there was no like greater political ideology. It just became open source software, which is like the way that most software nowadays is developed, where you can like view code and you can like make contributions to like big like commercial software repositories. Like any Joe Schmo who knows how to program, like they can go onto like some like React, which is like the programming language that Facebook is developed in, is an open source project. So anybody can like go onto the React GitHub and like make a contribution, and if it's good, then the main developers will like incorporate it into the main code base, and then like anybody like you or I could like in some like minor way change Facebook or something. We could like contribute to Facebook or any number of like commercial applications, as well as like open source or free applications that don't have like a proprietary license to them like Facebook does. But like that is just like the logical development of free software, the idea of free software, absent any kind of political movement with it. Like of course capitalism is just going to like incorporate it into itself and figure out how to like make profit off of it. Like, because like the fact is that open source development is a more efficient way of developing software, because like everybody's able to contribute to it. Like you get a lot of eyes on something, and like you get a diversity of like programmers with different backgrounds, blah blah blah. And like the way that it's able to be incorporated into the profit machine is because you have like developers who are on the payroll, and their job is to develop open source software. Like Android, for example, is another big one. Like Android is based on the Linux kernel. It's open source software. Anybody can go onto the Android repository and like make a contribution to it. But at the same time, like they're making profit off of it, because I guess like certain aspects of it are closed, and it's able to be sold in a way. Anyway, this is like a long tangent, but I think it has to do vaguely with what we're talking about.
I feel like it is a really big topic, but like web stuff, code stuff, all of this is like, I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't studied it too deeply, but I feel like it is worth keeping an eye on, because this is like a very like an emergent kind of like industry, which seems to be like rapidly taking on importance in the world. And I think in the future it will, who knows, like what we're seeing now, like all of this like virtual stuff, like what this will mean socially, politically. Like, I mean, already like the world's richest person is an internet guy, like Jeff Bezos, and like websites like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, they all have a great deal of power. And like I just see this trend, maybe not those particular websites, but the idea in general, like web conglomerates having actual power in the world. I mean, already that's the case. Google and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, these are all like important areas for consideration, but it's like hard to draw like firm conclusions because it's all so new.
Yeah, I was just reading some news story recently about a man who, like a black man somewhere in the United States, who was like wrongly convicted of a crime because some facial recognition software like misattributed his face as the criminals or whatever.
Oh yeah, because I've heard a lot of those facial recognition softwares, they're designed to recognize white faces, so there's a lot of trouble with non-white faces.
Yeah. So that kind of shit is very pervasive, and it's like becoming more and more an aspect of everyday life. But I don't know if it's strictly relevant to the topic of the essay at hand.
Yeah, we use the essay as a jumping off point on that one.
Yeah, whatever. So I guess like on the topic of like whether or not like web development and software development technology more broadly is like a very important topic for us to all keep an eye on, and it's gaining more and more like power in the real world over our everyday lives. Like algorithms and AI are like determining so much of our political possibilities, as well as like our material possibilities and our security, privacy, blah 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 blah. But I think the general thesis of this essay is that programmers cannot meaningfully like rebel or like fight against that development on their own. Perhaps the idea is that like in other industries, there's a greater possibility for fighting against capital, because like the actual activity that you're doing is less like directly linked up to the logic of capitalism. I don't know. But I think like comparing like programming and development and resistance within that domain to like another industry is fruitful, because like I think like their thesis here, it does go back to like team-based labor, and like you can't, like their idea is that you cannot meaningfully resist in this industry because the industry and like the labor and the job and like the mindset of everybody doing the job has already been like in some way predetermined by the logic of capital, so that like in order to go against that logic, you're only harming yourself rather than capital. But compare that to like working in a restaurant, for example. How do you think it compares? Like in the middle of like a busy service, when you're like in a flow state and like doing a really good job and like serving a bunch of people or whatever, or like cooking a bunch of food, you're kind of like operating within the logic of capital already.
Something I had actually thought about after I read, because like as we were discussing before we just started recording, like reading this piece, there wasn't like a huge amount of theoretical information contained, but what it did give me was like a sense of personal reflection of previous jobs that I've worked. And I have worked in restaurants, I have worked in kitchens, and I was reflecting on, like as you said, these busy shifts where you go into sort of flow state, and even though like I personally in my own life don't aspire to be a chef or don't aspire to work in kitchens, it's like quite far from anything I have a genuine passion for. Like I barely cook at all when I'm home. Just being in that environment and working, it does put you into this sort of like focused, flowing mentality where there's like this feeling of camaraderie, like you and everyone else in the kitchen is in this difficult, hot, loud, chaotic environment, but you're all in it together. And like there's this feeling when it really like coalesces that you've become sort of like this one organism that's like moving in synchronicity, and like there's even a sort of like an enjoyability to it. It's like this feeling of like actualizing labor, and it feels good in the moment. But then as you're walking home and you're exhausted and you're going home ostensibly to like work on your own projects, like the things that you actually want to do, and you realize like all of your like vital energy for the day was used up in that process, it like fills you with a lot of questioning.
Yeah, it's because like the horizon has been set, and like there's no possibility other than work. Like it's not a voluntary thing. Like like being in a flow state in a kitchen is comparable as well to playing a team-based sport, which is something that people do for recreation and pleasure. Some people do it for money, not many. Most people do it for recreation and pleasure. And like when you're leaving a sports game after like exhausted and in some way satisfied, you don't have the same feeling of like ennui or like dissatisfaction that you get when you're leaving your job, even if it was like an enjoyable busy night. because, you know, like you have to go to that job.
It's almost frightening in a way because like, you know, I'm kind of like tuned into like these sort of shifts in my own brain chemistry, but I would like realize as I was walking home from a busy shift, like, you know, like before the shift I hadn't wanted to go into work. I was enjoying the shift while I was doing it, just because, like, you know, if you're going to do something for like 8, 9, maybe even 11 hours, like, you may as well get into it. You may as well make the most of it. And then as you're walking home, you realize, like, it almost feels like your own, like, personal sense of identity. Like, those aspects of being that you identify with, those little projects that are your own, almost got, like, co-opted by, like, this other force, this, like, will to, like, act out this position in the capitalist hierarchy, which, you know, when I'm working, like, say, it's a standard 8-hour workday, even though often most of the jobs I've had in my workday would actually be longer than that. But let's say even if it was just an 8-hour workday, oh, well, you're awake for 16 hours. That's not too bad. But then when you factor in, like, you know, traveling to work and preparing for work, like getting showered, making food, like cleaning your house, all that necessary, like, basically work at home.
Reproduction,
like, look at that, and it's like you work for 8 hours, and then you maybe have 3 or 4 hours of free time, of diminished energy, because you used up a lot of it on. So, like, at most, you have half the time that you spent working for capitalism to work on, like, all of that other stuff that hopefully is going to get you in a position where you can, like, I don't know, be an entrepreneur, or be self-employed, doing what you love, or whatever it is you're, like, supposed to just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and do. Yeah, you have, like, less than half of the time. Like,
I mean, this actually gets into like something that is in this essay. Like they go on to talk about freelancing in the programming industry and how terrible that is. Because like even as they're kind of like bemoaning this hardened separation between work and life, working a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and then, you know, Friday there's this like humongous sense of possibility, and then you like drink it all away, you party hard, and then like the next 2 days are spent in a depressive coma, and then like Sunday evening, you know, you're just filled with the dread of the next work week. Like that to them is preferable to being a freelancer where there's absolutely no distinction. At least when you have a job, even if it's like an exhausting job like working in the kitchen, like there is a separation between work and life, between the two spheres of existence. But like freelancing, being your own boss, being an entrepreneur, like there's that distinction completely breaks down, and 100% of your time needs to be like in the same mode of working, because like that's the only way that you're going to be able to like keep the money coming.
Yeah, like having known a few small business owners, like not even having worked for all of them, like some of them I just knew them as people. They basically seemed like they were always on the clock. Like they were always like thinking about their business, always like thinking about like the next concern, like the next potential threat, like or how to expand, like. And this is a theme that Marx especially and has like outlined in his work repeatedly, is that like the capitalist end of like the capitalist proletariat relation isn't necessarily like in a better or more free position than the proletariat, even though they might enjoy certain like materialist excesses from time to time. Like just based on the small business owners I've known, like they in a lot of ways feel like they have less freedom. Like when something like the coronavirus shutdown happens, they are far more stressed out about it, like because suddenly their whole future is like cast into question, and is like seems like it's about to collapse, and like everything they've spent so many years like working hard to build up is just going to be wiped away.
Mm-hmm. They go. I'll read a quote here towards the end, page 165. Beyond the specific syntax of a language, isn't it a particular logic or way of operating that is brought into play when one thinks in this way? It is one that I suspect is not neutral, the abstract, instrumental logic of high-tech capitalism, a logic of discrete processes, operations, resources, a logic tied to particular ontologies, the objects, classes, and instances of object-oriented programming, the entities of markup languages like HTML. This is the logic which increasingly inhabits my thought. And when thought becomes a mode of activity that is productive for capital, the work for which one is actually paid, when that mode of activity becomes a habit of mind that springs into motion as if by love possessed, independent of one's willed intentional exertion, doesn't this prompt us to wonder whether the worker here is entirely the bourgeois subject that capital always summoned to the marketplace? Whether the subject of the labor process is the centered individual who had set about making his own world if it were not for the alienating, abstractive power of value? When I find myself observing myself sleepwalking, I observe myself acting in an alienated way, thinking in a manner that is foreign to me, working outside of the formal labor process through the mere spontaneous act of thought. Who is to say that the overcoming of this alienation will not be that language taking its place as mother tongue, that alienation will not entirely swallow that which it alienates?
Who is to say that the overcoming of this alienation will not be the language taking its place as mother tongue? That alienation will not entirely swallow that which it alienates. Now, like, to me, that seems, I don't know, like there's potentially big implications in this idea. It seems like, you know, like this idea of like the work mentality of like the machinic conscious of capital sort of like replacing whatever pre-existing human consciousness or like collective, like cultural identity of humanity existed before it. I think this is something that, and incidentally, I don't endorse Nick Land, but it's something he talks about a lot. Like, he does have some interesting ideas on this subject about like the development of capital as like this like emergent machine consciousness, which is kind of like, I don't know, like he views it almost as like a collective AI.
So the idea here is that like the logic of capitalism will become so pervasive within human consciousness that it will no longer, like, labor performed under capitalism will no longer be alienated because like we are fully assimilated into the system or something.
Yeah, like there won't even be anything left to resist.
Right. I mean, that's
like this is, I think, right accelerate, or not necessarily right accelerationism, but a certain branch of accelerationism that's just like, oh well, what if we just replaced everything with capitalist logic, so
right.
that there wasn't anything to resist it anymore?
It's a pretty alarming thought.
Yeah, Nick Land's a pretty alarming guy. It's like, it's the sort of thing that when you're thinking of potentialities, you want to think of like all the potentialities, just so that you know the range of like what you're working with.
Do you think that fits within Marx's own concepts of alienation? Because he talks about how, I think he talks more about alienation outside of capital, but he talks about, he says that alienation is like an objective condition, whether or not it's like a subjectively perceived thing. So like it's just the idea of like your labor. It's like the whole inversion of the abstract thing where like your labor is being siphoned off and blah blah blah, like abstract whatever. But it's not, I mean, I don't know, like there are a lot of people under capitalism who do not feel subjectively alienated, who do not feel alienated, but the idea is that they are alienated whether or not they feel it. So, like, if capitalist logic becomes so pervasive that nobody feels alienated, we're still going to be alienated.
Yeah.
Even if, like, our unconscious is restructured in such a way by the value form that, like, we are dreaming in code and, like, doing labor. If all labor becomes like intellectual, and then like the way that we think from birth is conditioned by capitalist logic, so that we can only, like, all of our thoughts at every moment are labor.
Profit motivated.
Yeah.
Thoughts.
Then I mean, that's a scary thought, but
Like it's difficult to talk about because like to the individual who would be living within that, like they'd be like, well, they wouldn't even see the alternative, so they'd be like, what's the problem?
right.
You know, it's like it exists as a problem insofar as like, and I think we're pretty far into this development. Like from birth, you're put into like the public school system, which is largely doing like what you suggested, like trying to condition you into capitalist logic. But I think we're still in a point in history where we can see an alternative, and we can see the potential for that alternative being eroded away, and that's what makes it frightening.
Yeah, it's not like all thought is really like structured or conditioned in this way. Like when we think about like arts and culture, or just like just general like chit chat and like random thoughts. I mean, is that structured by capital like this? Like, is it following some kind of capitalist logic?
Hard to say, like.
I guess I think I've spoken a bit about this hypothetical future where we all have brain chips, and like everybody's job will be to like perform on social media, and like that will every other type of work will be automated. So there will still be need to be like some industry for human beings, and that industry will be to like present our lives and provide online content. Like, I think that's a hypothetical that I'm writing a novel about that, so stay tuned. But it's also something that I just kind of like jokingly brought up in one of our earlier episodes.
Like the
But
very first episode.
yeah, but like you know, in such a condition, I mean, that is really like the only state where like this kind of thing would be true. Like where like literally every thought that we have, even about like culture and just like mundane thoughts about our relationships with other people or whatever, because it would be like commodified as like a piece of content or whatever, like then it becomes like tied to profit and blah blah blah.
Yeah, and this is like getting to one of those like frontier edges where I gotta admit that I still have like a lot of like reading and contemplation to do on like so many subjects, like the nature of consciousness and like human interaction, and like it's just like such an incredibly complex topic that like,
Yeah.
there's a lot left for me to learn here.
Yeah, there's a lot left for all of us to learn, really. Well, is there anything else to be said? We're almost at an hour.
Yeah, so I guess that's Endnotes.
Endnotes
Volume
Volume 2.
You did not read Volume 1.
No.
Yet.
Yet.
Probably won't, but maybe we
Yeah,
get bored.
maybe someday.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for number 3. We'll be starting without a beat, so that'll be coming up next week. My name is Uriah Mark Todorov. You can follow me on Twitter at The Inverted Form. Link in the description. Owen, how can people find you?
Find me on the internet at world3.tk. I think I'm one of the key contributors to repopularizing the .tk domain name.
Nice. That's a free domain, right?
Yeah, it's like some small island nation in the South Pacific that gives its domains away for free.
Yeah, I remember I had one of those when I was a very young teenager because it was free, but I couldn't figure out how to actually do anything with it.
Yeah,
So.
well, they give you the domain, but they don't actually give you any web space, so you still gotta buy the web space, which I found out the hard way. But yeah, you can get my music on my website. I'm actually just redesigning. I'm recoding to tie it back a little bit to this discussion.
Great.
My website, but yeah, my stuff is on there.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. Leave a comment. Let us know what you think, and see you next time.